Inside a luxury office, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the halls. A 10-year-old girl screamed, "I hate everyone!" and threw a $10,000 vase onto the marble floor. Assistants pressed themselves against the walls, terrified. A man in a janitor's uniform walked in carrying a mop, his steps calm and unhurried. He spoke softly. "That vase was beautiful, but even when it breaks, water can still reflect light." The girl stopped crying, stared at him. "Who let you in here?" "Nobody," he smiled gently. "I just clean up tears, the ones on the floor and the ones in hearts." The entire room fell silent. His name was Ethan Cole, 37 years old, single father working as a janitor at Grant Holdings, a 70-story glass tower in Manhattan that touched the clouds and looked down on the city like a throne. He lost his wife 3 years ago to cancer, watched her fade away in a hospital bed while holding her hand and promising to take care of their daughter no matter what it took. His daughter Lily was 8 years old, gentle soul with big eyes and a quiet smile. She loved to draw pictures of birds and flowers, spent hours coloring in silence while he worked double shifts to keep their small apartment. Their life was simple. Breakfast was cold toast and orange juice. Dinner was pasta and stories read under a single lamp. Weekends were walks in the park, feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs saved from lunch. Ethan used to be a music teacher for children, specialized in working with kids who had emotional difficulties. But he quit after his wife died because he needed steady income and health insurance. Needed something reliable that wouldn't demand too much of his heart when his heart was already broken. He loved children, understood their emotions in ways most adults forgot, but he kept that past buried deep, hidden under the blue janitor uniform and the mop bucket he pushed through marble hallways. Victoria Grant was 34 years old, CEO of Grant Holdings, cold eyes and colder demeanor. She lost her husband in a car accident 5 years ago and never remarried, never even dated, just threw herself into work like it could fill the emptiness. She had one daughter, Amber, 10 years old, brilliant mind trapped in rebellion, a girl who had gone through 6 tutors in 2 years because nobody could handle her tantrums, her anger, her desperate need for attention that came out all wrong. Her assistant complained constantly. "No one can deal with that child. She throws things, screams, refuses to study. The last tutor quit after she poured paint on his briefcase." Victoria's response was always the same, delivered in a voice flat as concrete. "I pay them to do their job, not to have feelings about it." One morning, Amber shattered a crystal vase in her mother's office, expensive art piece imported from Italy, fragments scattered across the floor like frozen tears. Employees fled the room afraid of being blamed or yelled at. Only Ethan remained, calmly sweeping up the pieces with his dustpan and brush. He knelt down and spoke the words from the hook, gentle and honest, treating the broken vase like it still had meaning. Amber stood frozen. For the first time in years, someone hadn't yelled at her, hadn't called her names, hadn't looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. Victoria burst into the office, fury radiating from every step. "Who gave you permission to speak to my daughter?" Ethan stood up slowly, dustpan in hand, voice calm. "Nobody, ma'am, but it seemed like she needed to hear something real." "You're fired!" Amber suddenly screamed, shocking everyone. "No, I like him!" Victoria stared at her daughter. This was the first time Amber had ever defended anyone. The first time she'd shown care for another person in so long Victoria had forgotten what it looked like. "You can stay temporarily, but you keep your distance from my daughter." Ethan just bowed his head respectfully. "I only clean floors, ma'am. I don't touch anyone." As he turned to leave, pushing his cart toward the door, Amber ran after him, her voice small and uncertain. "Do you know how to clean pianos?" He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen all day. "If that piano knows how to sing, I'll clean it very gently." The girl smiled back, a tiny, fragile thing, the first smile in years that reached her eyes. Later that evening, Ethan sat with Lily in their small apartment. She was drawing a picture of a rainbow while he heated up leftover spaghetti on their old stove. "Daddy, did something good happen today?" He looked at his daughter's innocent face and thought about Amber, about the pain behind her anger. about how much she reminded him of the kids he used to help before everything fell apart. Maybe, baby, maybe something good is starting. Lily handed him her drawing, a rainbow with two figures underneath, one tall and one small. This is us, we bring color to sad places. He taped it to their refrigerator next to a dozen others, a gallery of hope in a tiny kitchen, and whispered a promise to his late wife wherever she was watching. I'm still trying to help them, honey, just like you taught me. Over the following days, Amber started sneaking down to the maintenance room where Ethan worked. She'd slip away from her private tutors and nannies, finding him organizing cleaning supplies or fixing broken equipment, and he never sent her away, never told her she didn't belong there. She asked him one afternoon while he polished brass railings, "Why aren't you afraid of my mother?" "Because I used to be more afraid of losing someone I loved." He taught her small things, how to clean windows until they were invisible, how to plant seeds in old tin cans and watch them grow, simple lessons that felt bigger than they were. Plants need light to live. People are the same way. Amber looked down at her hands. "I don't have any light." "You do, someone just needs to turn it on." Victoria noticed the changes. Amber smiled more often, slept through the night without screaming, stopped throwing things and breaking furniture. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, and when she asked her assistant what had changed, the answer made her uncomfortable. "The girl listens to that janitor." Victoria frowned, jaw tight with something between jealousy and disbelief. "A janitor is teaching my daughter?" One evening, Victoria arrived at the office earlier than usual because she couldn't sleep, and found Ethan teaching Amber to play piano in the empty conference room, the sound of music floating through the halls like something sacred, the girl laughing with pure joy. "Remember what I said, each note is a drop of light." Victoria stood in the doorway watching, something stirring in her chest that she'd buried years ago, something that felt dangerously like emotion, but she pushed it down and walked in with ice in her voice. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Ethan stood up immediately, respectful but not apologetic. "I'm teaching her to listen to her own heart. Get out." Amber burst into tears. Real tears, not the angry kind. Tears of frustration and pain. "Mom, he didn't do anything wrong." Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "He's using your sympathy. Can't you see that? He's manipulating you." Ethan said nothing, just walked out quietly, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty office. And when he was gone, Amber screamed at her mother with all the hurt she'd been holding inside for years. "You never listened to me! Never!" That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She lay in her king-size bed in her penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling. And finally, she pulled up the security camera footage from the conference room, watched it with the volume up, and heard her daughter laughing, heard the piano playing, heard Ethan's voice saying something that broke through all her walls. "Music doesn't teach us to be richer, it teaches us to listen." She cried for the first time in 5 years, hot tears running down her face in the darkness, grieving not just for her dead husband, but for the mother she'd failed to become. The next morning, she found an email in her inbox from Amber's school account. Just one line that made her hand shake as she read it. "Thank you for cleaning my heart." Victoria closed her laptop and put her head in her hands, realizing she'd been so busy building an empire that she'd forgotten to build a home, so focused on control that she'd lost connection. And the person who'd shown her daughter more love in 2 weeks was the man she paid minimum wage to sweep her floors. She called her assistant voice hoarse. Find out everything about Ethan Cole, his background, education, work history, everything. Within hours, she had a file on her desk, and what she read made her world tilt on its axis. Ethan wasn't just a janitor. He had a master's degree in music therapy, specialized in working with autistic children and kids with severe emotional trauma. He'd published papers in academic journals, won awards for his teaching methods, been on track to become a director at a prestigious children's hospital. Then his wife died, and he walked away from it all. She picked up her phone, dialed his number, her hand trembling slightly. "Ethan, this is Victoria Grant. I need to speak with you. It's about Amber." His voice was calm, steady, No anger or resentment. Is she okay? No. And I don't know how to help her, but I think you do. There was a long pause, the sound of him breathing on the other end of the line, and finally he said the words that changed everything. I'll help her, but only if you're willing to help yourself first. Amber secretly sent him an email that night. Thank you for cleaning my heart. 1 month later, Victoria's company faced a massive media crisis. Internal scandal broke in the press. Accusations of financial misconduct that weren't true but spread like wildfire anyway. Shareholders demanded her resignation. Board members turned against her. The empire she'd built with blood and sleepless nights was crumbling. She worked 18-hour days trying to control the damage, forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, forgot she had a daughter who needed her, and Amber felt more invisible than ever before. One night, Amber disappeared, ran away from home in the middle of the night wearing just pajamas and a jacket. Victoria came home from the office at midnight and found an empty bedroom. Panic seized her throat like hands choking her. She called the police, called security, her voice shaking with terror she'd never felt even in boardrooms. The first person she called after the police was Ethan, her pride completely shattered, her voice breaking over the phone. Ethan, please, she's gone. My daughter is missing. I need your help. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, just got in his old car and started driving, thinking about what Amber had told him weeks ago during one of their secret conversations. When I'm sad, I hide in the place with the old piano. He drove to the abandoned music center on the east side, a building scheduled for demolition, and there in the darkness he found her sitting at a dusty piano, her small hands shaking as she tried to play a melody she barely remembered. He walked slowly across the creaking floor, his footsteps announcing his presence without startling her. Music sounds better when someone's listening. Amber broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. She only cares about money. She doesn't care about me. That's not true. Your mother just doesn't know how to show what she feels. Sometimes people build walls so high they forget how to find the door. Victoria burst through the entrance, having tracked Ethan's location through his phone, and she ran to her daughter, wrapped her arms around the girl, and held on like she was drowning. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry for everything. Amber looked up at Ethan through her tears. You were right. Mom has light, but she doesn't know how to turn it on. Mother and daughter held each other and cried, years of distance dissolving in that moment, and Victoria realized that almost losing her daughter had finally taught her what mattered. Later that week, Victoria sat across from Ethan in a coffee shop, neutral ground away from the office and its power dynamics. She had Amber's file open on the table, and next to it was Ethan's old personnel file from the hospital where he used to work. You weren't just a janitor, you were a specialist in music therapy for children with autism and severe trauma. You published research, won awards. Why did you hide all of that? Ethan stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into brown patterns. Because sometimes people only listen when you stop talking, when you just show up quietly and do the work without needing credit. Victoria leaned forward, her business armor finally cracked. I want to offer you something. Come back to teaching. I'll fund a music therapy program through the company foundation. We'll help hundreds of children like Amber. You don't need me. You need to believe in your daughter. I want both. He looked at her carefully, seeing past the CEO facade to the scared mother underneath. If I do this, you have to be part of it. You can't just write checks and walk away. Amber needs to see you caring about something besides profit margins. She nodded, tears threatening again. I will, I promise. The program launched 3 months later, a grand opening with press coverage and ribbon cutting. Victoria stood at the podium in front of cameras and donors and said something she'd never said publicly before. The man who cleans our building doesn't just clean floors. He cleans the distance between people. He reminded me that success means nothing if you're alone at the top. Ethan received a standing ovation. People he'd never met applauding like he was a hero. But he only looked at Amber standing beside him, holding his hand, her smile bright and real and healing. The twist nobody expected came during the press conference when a reporter asked Victoria, "Why did you choose a janitor to run this program?" She answered without hesitation, voice strong and clear. "Because he saw my daughter when I was blind, because he taught her to hear music when I'd forgotten how to listen, and because the most important work is often done by people we never notice." That evening, Ethan and Victoria walked through the new music therapy center, watching children play instruments and laugh, watching trained therapists work with kids who'd been written off as hopeless cases, and Victoria stopped in front of a wall where they'd hung a photo of the old piano from the abandoned building. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "For the man who cleaned more than floors, he cleaned hearts." Ethan read it and smiled softly, thinking about his late wife and how she'd always believed that helping others was the highest calling. She would have loved this. Victoria touched his arm gently, the first physical contact between them that wasn't professional. "Your wife?" "Yeah, she was the one who taught me that broken things can still make beautiful sounds if you're patient enough to listen." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Amber teach a younger child how to hold drumsticks properly. The girl who'd been unreachable just months ago now reaching out to help others. And Victoria realized that sometimes the people you overlook are the ones who change everything. 1 year later, the Music for Hope program had expanded across 3 states. Hundreds of children with emotional and behavioral problems were finding healing through music therapy. Kids who'd been expelled from schools, kids who'd lost parents, kids who'd given up on themselves were learning to play instruments and discovering that their pain could become something beautiful. Ethan taught classes 5 days a week. Victoria funded the expansion and attended every major event, and Amber performed at showcases, playing piano for audiences who didn't know she used to throw vases and scream at everyone who tried to help her. One evening, Amber wrote a letter to her father, the man who died before she was old enough to remember him. Her mother found it on her desk and read it with tears streaming down her face. "Dad, I don't hate sounds anymore. I found someone who taught me to hear love again." At the grand opening of the new downtown center, the biggest facility yet with 20 music therapy rooms and a concert hall, Victoria stepped onto the stage in front of 500 people, donors and journalists and families, whose children had been transformed by the program. "I used to think the impossible meant controlling other people, forcing them to fit into my vision of success, but the hardest thing is learning to trust, learning to let go, learning to see people clearly instead of just seeing what they can do for you." She turned to Ethan standing in the wings, gestured for him to join her on stage. "This man taught me that lesson. Thank you for showing me what actually matters." The symbol of their transformation stood in the lobby of the new center, the old piano from the abandoned building restored and polished, and beneath it a small plaque with words that captured everything. "For the man who cleaned more than floors, he cleaned hearts." Ethan brought Lily to every event, his quiet daughter who'd watched him rebuild his life piece by piece. And she became friends with Amber, the 2 girls inseparable, drawing pictures together and playing duets on matching pianos. One afternoon, Victoria found them in a practice room, Lily teaching Amber a new song, and she realized that this family she'd accidentally created with a janitor and 2 daughters was more real than anything she'd built in the corporate world. She pulled Ethan aside later, her voice uncertain in a way business meetings never made her. "I don't know how to do this, the personal stuff. I'm good at contracts and negotiations, but terrible at feelings." He smiled, understanding in his eyes. "You're learning, that's what matters. Amber sees you trying, and that's enough." "Is it enough for you?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and fear. And he answered carefully, "I'm not looking for anything except helping kids and being a good father. If something else develops naturally, then we'll figure it out. But let's not rush what's already working." She nodded, relieved and slightly disappointed at the same time. But knowing he was right, some things couldn't be forced or scheduled. They had to grow at their own pace, like the plants he'd taught Amber to nurture in tin cans. That night, the 4 of them ate dinner together at a small restaurant. Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries. Lily and Amber giggling over inside jokes while Ethan and Victoria talked about expanding the program to underserved communities. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt something she'd forgotten existed. Peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of purpose. Not control, but connection. Not perfection, but enough. On the way home, Amber held her mother's hand, something she hadn't done since she was very small. "Mom, do you think broken things can be fixed?" Victoria looked at Ethan walking ahead with Lily on his shoulders and smiled. "I think broken things can become something even better if the right person helps clean up the pieces. If you respect those who heal quietly without needing recognition, comment respect." 2 years after that first broken vase, Ethan and Victoria stood together in the back of a concert hall watching children perform. The annual showcase had become a major event drawing national media attention. But for them, it was simpler than that. It was watching healing happen in real time. Amber played the first piece she'd ever learned with Ethan, her fingers confident on the keys, the melody filling the room with light, and beside her Lily accompanied on violin. The two girls had become sisters in everything but name. When they finished and took their bows, the audience rose in standing ovation. But Amber only looked back at Ethan and Victoria, seeking approval from the two people who mattered most. Victoria leaned close to Ethan, her voice barely audible over the applause. "You did the impossible. You reached her when nobody else could. It wasn't because I was special. It was because I'd felt the same pain. Broken people recognize each other." "Do you still feel broken?" He watched the girls laughing together on stage and smiled. "No, but I remember how it felt, and that memory makes me better at helping others find their way out." After the performance, Amber presented Ethan with a drawing she'd made, a janitor's mop transformed into a grand piano, the handle becoming keys, the mop head becoming strings. "This is you. You clean with music." He knelt down to her level, accepted the gift with reverence. "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep cleaning." Later that evening, the four of them returned to the first center, the original building where everything started, and stood in front of the restored piano, the one from the abandoned building where Ethan had found Amber on that desperate night. Victoria had commissioned a small memorial plaque to be installed that day, and they unveiled it together, the words simple but profound. "Sometimes the people who clean up after us are actually cleaning up what's inside us." Ethan read it and felt his late wife's presence, imagining her proud of what he'd built, proud that he'd found a way to use his pain to help others, proud that he'd given their daughter a life filled with purpose and love. The final scene showed them leaving the center as the sun set, long shadows stretching across pavement, and overhead the sign glowed in warm light. Grant Cole Music Therapy Foundation, two names joined together representing two broken people who'd found healing by helping children remember how to sing. A voiceover played over images of children playing instruments, laughing, growing. Sometimes people don't need perfection. They just need someone patient enough to help them clean the pain away. Amber's voice joined in, older now, wiser, narrating from the future. "I was the girl nobody could handle until a janitor showed me that being broken wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a different song." The screen faded to black with one final message. Every person cleaning floors might be cleaning something deeper. Look closer. If you believe patience can heal more than power, share this story and subscribe. We tell moments that remind the world that sometimes kindness does the impossible.